Hello, I'd like to read an excerpt from my book, The Adventures of Isabelle, Book 2, Journey to Orphalese. This is a passage entitled The Cave of the Shadows. She was peering through the dense fog to try and see what lay ahead of them when the mouth of a cave appeared. It was illuminated by torches, casting sinister shadows on the rocks and within the fog. As they drew nearer, it seemed as if the shadows moved independently of their sources of light. They danced slowly in all directions, creating a dizzying effect on Isabelle. These shadows took on human-like form, and she wondered if her eyes were playing tricks on her. She stood and looked around her, mesmerized by the dancing shadows throwing themselves around the torches that lighted the path to the cave. She was terrified, yet drawn toward the dark opening in the rocks. With halting steps, she walked toward the gaping mouth of the cave. Once there, she looked back, realizing that she had no choice. She could no longer return to the ship, even if she wanted to. Taking a deep breath, she took one of the torches from the rusty iron sconce on the rock wall and slowly began to make her way into the cave. The shadows seemed to follow her, for when she stepped into the dark cave and the torch threw its light on the walls, they danced in every direction. It was cold and damp. She could hear water dripping from the ceiling. She held the torch aloft and could see that she was now in an enormous cavern, standing on a path that led downward to where she could not imagine. She suddenly became aware of another presence in the cave. She thought she heard the shuffling of feet and then whispered noises, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She blinked into the dark area outside the arc of light thrown by the torch, but she could see no one. Then, right next to her, someone hissed loudly in her ear, "Go back!" She spun around, suddenly expecting to come face to face with someone, but no one was there. Again she heard the loud whisper, this time further off. Other voices joined this one, and they started to speak at once, coming from all directions, swooping at her and away like bats. Some of the voices were whispers, but others came as hostile shouts and violent screams. "Go back! You will fail! You will never make it to Orphalese. Give up. This is a foolish quest. Return to the sleeping dragon where you belong." "Silence! What do you think you are? Who are you giving me orders?" Isabelle yelled back. But the voices only ignored her and grew louder and more aggressive, flinging curses at her from all directions. "You are worthless, a failure. You deserve nothing better. Why don't you just go back to Flint? Orphalese is dead. Dead. Just surrender. Give up. You are weak and worthless." These tormenting taunts continued. The voices were echoing all around her. She could feel them, but she could not see anyone. The voices grew louder and came at her faster. She felt she would go insane, or that she already was, but something told her that she had to ignore these voices, that she had to continue her descent into the bowels of the cave. The rock walls had grown narrower, but just ahead she saw an opening and faint light emanating from the interior. She did not know what lay ahead. She only knew that she must press on. As she neared the opening, she became aware of a horrible smell that had begun to permeate the air. She was almost overcome by the smell of sulfur and decay that must have been coming from the cavern to which she was headed. By now, the voices were a deafening cacophony of hatred, reaching a fever pitch. The narrow opening in the rock wall, emitting the faint light, lay about 10 yards ahead of her. She hurried toward it, and as she passed the threshold, her foot was caught on something soft. She went sprawling, and the torch flew out of her hand toward the wall in front of her. Just before it was extinguished, she was able to make out the interior of the chamber.